Humanists Take on the World, Episode 4, Russia, Ukraine, Misinformation, and Fraud. Welcome to another episode of Humanists Take on the World. If you haven't joined us in a while, this is the podcast that used to be Atheist Nomads, and we rebranded last month. And we're moving along, and one thing that's been kind of interesting is this episode's going to be news with all the stuff going on in the world right now, and so covering some topics, but yeah, no interview this time, and Lauren's not doing well, so it's just me. And yeah, the last time I recorded, I'm doing this the day before release, so March 20. And the last time I'd recorded was on March 27. It's been quite a while. Or excuse me, February 27. It's been 3 weeks, and oh boy, has stuff gone on in the world. When we recorded that interview for episode 3, I didn't want to get into all the Russia stuff because, well, for one, it wasn't relevant to the interview, and for two, we were recording it a week before release, and, fast-moving events. And then also, there was the fact that I'd been so swamped with work that I didn't really feel up to covering stuff like that. It has been nice getting a little bit of a break, 3 weeks since last recording. It's been 2 weeks since I last edited an episode. So that's been a little bit nice. It has been a bit rough with all the work stress, with the changing the systems we're using at work, and my job basically being completely flipped inside out with what I do and still finding out what I do at work. And then, Lauren going through some issues with medication changes, and my mom having health issues, and it's been stressful, but moving along, and things are starting to get better. Kylie and Lauren both had a cold this week. Lauren did do a COVID test, and it was negative, so just a cold. I seem to not have gotten it, so that's good. But we're moving along. So let's go ahead and jump into the news. Russia and Ukraine. So, let's talk about what's been going on there. Since it's basically been the only thing in the news for the last couple of weeks, I'm sure you're all well aware, but on February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. This is the, next step of what started in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded the easternmost edges, and now they're going for at least half or 2/3 of the country, maybe even the whole thing. And it is worth going through quite a bit of the stuff that's going on. There has been a whole lot of pretty nasty, terrible stuff, like hospitals getting bombed, with their hospitals that are full of patients getting bombed under the pretext that they're military bases. No, they aren't. They're hospitals. This is a country with people that are trying to live their lives, but they've been invaded, and the military hasn't taken over everything, but Russia is trying to. They've also been deporting people from territories they've conquered in Ukraine, and bombing humanitarian evacuation routes to Western Ukraine or Poland, and are allowing any Ukrainians who want to go over to Russia to make that trip, which then they get resettled elsewhere in Russia. This is something that the Soviet Union did back in the 40s and 50s when they cracked down on some revolutionary activity in Ukraine and shipped a whole bunch of people off into Russia and Siberia and to the gulags, and then repopulated the area with Russians. That's one of the big reasons why Eastern Ukraine has a lot of Russian-speaking people who would identify as ethnically Russian. When you look at some of the claims that Putin is making, there is the claim that NATO has been trying to make Ukraine a nuclear power. That's not true. That's just pretext for Russia to, really use for their takeover. They've made claims that Ukraine's been taken over by Nazis, that we're committing a genocide in eastern Ukraine, and that's why they had to invade. That's all complete BS. Yeah, there are neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. There is a neo-Nazi brigade that is currently a part of the Territorial Defense Force in Ukraine. From what I've heard, that group is actually currently working with Jewish commanders who had done their training and served in the Israeli military. So, one of the things that happens when a country gets invaded, all of those issues stop mattering, and then you just take on the enemy that is invaded. Also, definitely worth noting, claiming that Ukraine is being run by Nazis when the president is Jewish. Yeah, that's just complete bullshit. Putin has also made the claim that there is no Russia without Ukraine and no Ukraine without Russia, and that it is a part of their ethnic heritage and spiritual heritage, and there is some validity to that. The historical precursor to Russia was the Kievan Rus. That was which we covered in Atheist Nomads episode 298. The Kievan Rus was a group of Vikings that were put in charge of the Slavic peoples in what is now central and eastern Ukraine and parts of western Russia. Saying that's modern Russia is not even close to true. What ended up happening was the Mongols subjugated the Kievan Rus, and it was the princes of Moscow who were able to overthrow the Golden Horde, while the Golden Horde's territory shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until all they had was Crimea. And they eventually assimilated with the people in Crimea and became Turkified, speaking a Turkic language and adopting Islam, and became the Crimean Tatars. When what would be eventually identified as modern Russia, starting from Moscow and spreading out, it took them hundreds of years to capture Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, the modern capital of Ukraine. Yes, that had been the capital of the Kievan Rus, hence the name Kievan Rus, but it wasn't a part of the early days of Russia because the Golden Horde held on to it for a lot longer, and there was also the Austrian and eventually there was the Austrian and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who were much more powerful and able to take over that territory. By the 1700s, Western and Central Ukraine were under the control of the Russian Empire. The Russian Orthodox Church has claimed that the Patriarch of Moscow is the successor to the old Patriarch of Kiev. And as far as the pronunciation of Kiev versus Kiev, Kiev is the Russian pronunciation, Kiev is the Ukrainian pronunciation. It's a Ukrainian city, so I'm going to go with Kiev. As time progressed, Western Ukraine was mostly controlled by the House of Habsburg and the Austrian Empire, later the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when the continental European empires collapsed at the end of World War I, there were nationalist movements in a lot of territories. And the nationalist movements who didn't want to be a part of Russia, or didn't want to be a part of Austria, or didn't want to be a part of Germany, for the most part, got support from the Allies, and in Russia from the Bolsheviks, to go ahead and be independent. Well, the Bolsheviks supported that mostly so that they could maintain friendly relations and weasel their way in to get puppet governments so they could reconstitute everything. They also didn't think it was going to be necessary to have them be a part of Russia because they figured that within a few decades, there would be no nation states in the world. The whole world would be one massive communist utopia, presumably under a Russian dictator. That's not what happened. So Ukraine first became independent in 1917, more effectively 1918. And in 1919, the Ukrainian People's Republic, which was made up of modern-day eastern, central, and southern Ukraine, and the West Ukrainian People's Republic, united. That, of course, caused an anarchist uprising, and the White Army, trying to reinstitute the Russian Empire and the Tsar, was also trying to fight Ukraine, but Western Ukraine got absorbed into Poland as Poland was reestablished. It did not end up being a part of Ukraine when it became part of the Soviet Union. Effectively, they were part of the Soviet Union by 1921, but they were fully under Bolshevik control by 1921, and the part of Ukraine that is currently Central, Eastern, and Southern Ukraine was one of the founding members of the Soviet Union in 1922. During the Stalin years, Ukraine suffered greatly with famines caused by the forced confiscation of Ukrainian grain to help feed the cities in Russia. And there was also a lot of just straight up murder of Ukrainians and the deportation of Ukrainians to Siberia and other parts of Russia, with the forced relocation of Russians into Ukraine. Mostly in the east, closer to Russia, but throughout what was then a part of Ukraine. That would continue until 1939, when the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany and partitioned Poland, allowing Western Ukraine to be removed from Poland and integrated in with the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Russia also transferred Crimea from being part of the Russian Federal Socialist Soviet Republic to being a part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, because it made more sense to have it administered from Ukraine because of the land connection. All in all, it didn't really matter because it was all part of the Soviet Union. And that lasted until 1991, when Ukraine declared independence, along with the rest of the members of the Soviet Union. Ukraine has been independent since that time. Yes, it has been corrupt. Yes, it has often been barely functional as a country, but it has been independent. As NATO has been expanding, Ukraine has become the borderland. The name Ukraine means borderland. What Putin, at a minimum, is trying to accomplish is the rebuilding of the Russian Empire. To retake what's in the Russian Empire's borders, they need central, eastern, and southern Ukraine. If that's his goal, then he doesn't really care about Western Ukraine. If he's trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, then he does. From a purely humanistic perspective, the people of Ukraine have been supporting pro-Western governments. The people of Ukraine have been electing pro-Western governments, not pro-Russian governments. The people of Ukraine have made it clear they want to be a part of Europe, not a part of Russia. Ukraine has applied for both EU and NATO membership. Neither has gotten very far, in part because Ukraine didn't really have a military, at least not an effective military, until they were invaded by Russia. And Ukraine's economy hasn't ever really been that stable because, well, it was a part of the Soviet Union until 30 years ago. It took Vladimir Putin strong-arming the oligarchs to get Russia's economy under control, Ukraine hasn't had an equivalent. And it's a good thing they haven't had the equivalent. Because, dictatorships tend to not be good for anybody other than the dictator and his friends. From the humanist perspective, war is absolutely terrible. People are dying. People's lives are being destroyed. In wartime, the most vulnerable people fare the worst. And when a country gets conquered, the most vulnerable people get treated the worst. In the case of Ukraine, that includes its rather substantial Jewish population, their rather substantial black population that had been largely created by the Soviet Union bringing people from Africa to Ukraine for school and then keeping them there, and then allowing them to stay. And Russia's recent is in the last, decade, anti-LGBT, anti-abortion, anti-women's rights, anti-human rights, and, just about all other anti-anybody but Putin's rights moves mean Ukraine getting conquered by Russia is going to be bad for all Ukrainians. That's really sad. This proves that the quote-unquote New World Order that was created after the fall of the Soviet Union and the liberalizing somewhat of China resulted in a lot of peace. Very little warfare, and most of the warfare that was happening was at the hands of the U.S. trying to play World Cop and doing poorly at it. Well, that order has been shattered. On the one hand, I think the concept of national borders being sacred to be absurd, especially considering most national borders were created by imperialist powers who were being arbitrary, capricious, or trying to create an unstable grouping of people. In the case of modern Ukraine, it was the Bolsheviks who created the borders. They set that up to define something that they could work with. They picked the winners, they picked the losers, and they let a certain people group under a leader they could work with have control of that territory. So the concept that the national borders are sacred is, again, it's absurd. It's also absurd when you consider the horrific acts of imperial governments like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And yes, I know communists are officially anti-imperialistic, but also the communists have had two of the biggest empires in world history. With the forced relocation of people to take areas with what are minority populations within the empire, but majority populations in particular regions, and forcibly deporting people from that majority ethnic group and importing people from the majority ethnic group of the empire, a lot of those lines that might have made sense 100 years ago don't make sense now. That being said, a bloodthirsty dictator who is in charge of a great power taking that land is not the right way for that to work. The correct way for that to happen, for territorial boundaries to change now, is UN supervised and observed and probably even run referendums where the people in the area in question get to decide for themselves in free and fair elections. Crimea had a referendum, chose to join Russia, so Russia annexed them. That was not a free or fair referendum. It was one filled with a lot of intimidation and a lot of election rigging. If we want to have a peaceful world where humans can thrive, we need to respect the self-determination of people. In my dream world, there would be no national boundaries. They wouldn't be necessary. But that's not the world we live in. What Russia is doing is terrible. It is horrible. It is an upending of the 70 years of peace we have enjoyed, mostly around the world, since World War II. And it is a return to the imperialism of the 19th century. And that sucks. But we aren't done. There's been a lot of talk about misinformation and disinformation lately, and those are very important distinctions. Misinformation is a statement that is factually wrong that is shared with good intentions. Somebody who is unknowingly sharing wrong information is sharing misinformation. Disinformation is where somebody is intentionally sharing that information. Disinformation, when it is being produced by a government, is called propaganda. There are people in the US, mostly on the far-right fringe, who are upset about Russia Today and a handful of other Russian news sites getting demonetized and deprioritized on YouTube and in sources like Google News, Apple News, and Facebook. I believe they've also been suspended from Twitter, and they may have been suspended from Facebook. The people on the right, the far right, are saying that this is violating free speech. It's not. Absolutely is not. Private companies are not obligated to promote government propaganda from any government. If they were forced to promote government propaganda, especially of a hostile foreign government, then those companies would have no free speech. So the people that are saying that are, in some surveys, highly correlate with people who are refusing to get COVID vaccines. They are the people who have bought in wholeheartedly on Russian propaganda for years. So of course they're going to be pissed that that people are finally trying to stop Russia's propaganda machine from trying to gain more sympathy from people in the West. Pivoting a bit, when people are spreading when people are spreading disinformation, and it's coming from domestic sources, in some cases, they are parroting Russian propaganda. If you are parroting propaganda, you getting silenced is not a free speech problem. That is simply, you're a patsy of a hostile foreign power. And in that case, you do not deserve to have access to platforms of general public discourse. Then you have people like Ryan Cole. He's a medical doctor, a pathologist by specialty, runs a medical laboratory in Boise, Idaho. And at the point that I've said as much as I have, I do need to say the views expressed on this podcast do not necessarily represent the views of my employer, which I will not name, but it's not Cole Laboratories. I can tell you that much. He runs a medical laboratory and is currently the medical doctor on the Central District Health Board, covering Boise and surrounding counties to the east and north. He was nominated by the Ada County Republican Party, and he has been a COVID denialist from the beginning, despite his laboratory running a lot of COVID tests. He hasn't quite gone as far as COVID denialist. He's done everything but deny that it's real. He's made all kinds of bullshit claims. He's had his medical license in Washington suspended for writing prescriptions for ivermectin and producing bullshit vaccine exemption cards for people in Washington state. He's also been doing that for people in Idaho as well, And yeah, really pushing the ivermectin. Really pushing anything other than real medicine. He knows better. He has to know better. He's a medical doctor. He's a pathologist. He knows how this stuff works. He's run a significant portion of the COVID testing in the Treasure Valley. He knows what this pandemic looks like. But he's been spreading misinformation for profit and political gain. Oh, and as far as that political gain goes, he's has said, we'll see if he actually does, that he's going to run for Idaho governor. That is not just misinformation. That is fraud. Straight up, it's fraud. Yeah, I find it is a huge step in the right direction to be calling disinformation something other than just misinformation, to separate out the two. We need to take it further, and we need to call it propaganda, Russian propaganda, when that's what it is, and we need to call it fraud when it's a charlatan scamming people out of their money by spreading disinformation. And I have one more rant. The United States Senate unanimously passed a bill to make daylight saving time permanent. I have strong feelings on this topic, as I know I have mentioned on the show several times. I have lived in places where the time felt right. I have lived in places where the time doesn't. In Grants Pass, Oregon, the summer evenings are dark and cool. Well, okay, late evening in August, like after 8 o'clock, it's dark and it cools off. It's pleasant. You can actually spend time outside. I lived in Everett, Washington, where the sun sets quite late in the summer and there is very little daylight in the winter. I've lived in Western Michigan, which is way far west for Eastern time zone. And I live in Boise, Idaho, which if you look at the mountain time zone, it's a chunk of Pacific time that got gobbled up because of Mormons. When we're on daylight savings time, we're on double daylight saving. As of the date of release is the spring equinox. As such, the sun should be setting as close as possible to 6 o'clock. Well, not here. Try 8 o'clock. Solar noon on daylight saving time should be 1 o'clock. Not here. It's 1:52 p.m. We're in the wrong time zone. Permanent daylight saving for Boise means in the wintertime the sun won't rise until after 9 a.m. Yeah, it'll set at 5 or 6, but the day's just off. And it doesn't feel right. The bill that has passed the Senate is an improvement. We gotta stop changing the time. Pick something, let's go with it. One or the other. My personal preference would be, let's fix the time zone lines so they actually make sense, which would mean where I live, we'd be in Pacific time, and let's drop daylight saving permanently. It's stupid, it's ridiculous, it makes no sense. It's dumb. Our bodies need the sun to rise to wake us up, and we need the sun to set before we go to bed. That's how we evolved. Fucking with that is not helpful. If we did those two things, the sun would be setting at 6 o'clock today, and solar noon wouldn't be at 2 p.m. Being in double daylight saving, what the summertime is like, is the hottest part of the day is 5 to 7 p.m., and it doesn't get below 90 until 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. When that happens, you don't go outside in the evening. It's too hot. You can't do anything. It's too hot. You want to do something outside, you've got mornings on the weekend, and that's it. That sucks. That being said, permanent daylight saving has been tried before, 50 years ago. It was a 2-year trial during the energy crisis of 1972. It was horribly unpopular and it failed. It was repealed early. It was going to expire after 2 years, and it didn't even make it through a full year. As soon as people experience what daylight saving in the winter is like, in other words, what it's like in the winter in Boise, everywhere in the country, they were done. My favorite option is fix the time zones so that they actually align with the sun as closely as possible and drop daylight saving time. My second choice would be just drop daylight saving time. Keep the time zones where they are, go to permanent standard time. My third choice would be permanent daylight saving, which the Senate passed. And my least favorite option is continuing with the status quo. It's stupid and it doesn't make any sense, especially when you have a 4-year-old and 2 dogs. It does not make sense to change the time. Moving along, Idaho has had some really terrible bills this year. It looks like the abortion bill modeled after Texas's, but not quite as ridiculous. It allows any family member to be able to sue if an abortion happens. Bullshit, but not quite as bad as Texas's super bullshit one that allows anybody in the state to do it. That has passed the state legislature and is sitting on the governor's desk. He has a couple days left to sign or veto it or ignore it and allow it to become law. Don't know what's going to happen there. Considering that last year signed a total ban on abortions with a trigger for the moment that Roe versus Wade gets repealed, he's probably going to sign it. Idaho had a bill that got through the House that would prohibit any trans health care for anybody under the age of 18, including any gender confirmation surgeries or hormone treatments or puberty blockers. This is despite the fact that nobody would do gender confirmation surgery on somebody under the age of 18. That's not a thing that happens. And puberty blockers are a great way to prevent trans and questioning teens from killing themselves. This bill was dead on arrival at the state Senate and is not going anywhere. Interestingly, it was designed to be an update to the anti-female genital mutilation law that Idaho has. There was also a bill that would have allowed librarians and museum curators to be sued for objectionable material being checked out by available to or even seen by minors. That was also dead on arrival at the state Senate. So that was nice to see. The United States House of Representatives has a bill that is being considered by the House Judiciary Committee to make Lift Every Voice and Sing the official national hymn of the United States. This is a song that has been considered by many to be the Black national anthem. While it would be great to have a symbol of the country that's representative of Black Americans, the establishment of a hymn is not something a secular government should be doing. And I've got a link in the show notes to the Secular Coalition of America's call to action on this. And related to what we started off with, a handful of Russian Orthodox priests in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, have split from the Moscow Patriarch and are in talks with the Patriarch of Constantinople to join with him. This is huge, considering there was a schism between Moscow and Constantinople a couple years ago. That split was largely based on the Ukrainian Metropolitan of Kiev, Autocephalus, being the head of an independent church, not subject to the Patriarch of Moscow, which has resulted in a split in the Russian Orthodox Church, or the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, between some that are in communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople, some who are in communion with the Patriarch of Moscow, and some who are in communion with they don't know who the hell. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused quite the problems for the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Patriarch Kirill has been lockstep supporting Putin every step of the way and providing justifications for war crimes. So it's nice to see this happening. Since Putin brought them under his wing and brought Kirill under his wing and dominion, and made the Russian Orthodox Church effectively a department of the Russian government, it's nice to see that they're losing control of Orthodox churches outside of Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church, with the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, is distancing itself, and the Russian Orthodox Church in Western Europe is also distancing itself, while for the most part not trying to go as far as the one church in Amsterdam did. But it's kind of heartwarming to see. Out of all of this tragedy, there's got to be something. All right, we don't have any new feedback, but there's lots of ways to get hold of us. You can use the feedback form at htotw.com/contact. You can send us an email, feedback@htotw.com. You can leave us a voice message at 208-996-8667. You can also use SpeakPipe at htotw.com/speakpipe to record a message on the website. You can record something on your phone and email it to us. That works well. We don't have any new patrons, but we do have lots of ways to support us. You can use Patreon and support us on a monthly basis. And soon I will get it switched over to also be allowing annual pledges. We have PayPal for one-time donations, and I now have a link you can use to give us money one time with a credit or debit card, Apple Pay, or Google Pay. And you can find all of the links at htotw.com/donate. You can also check out our Discord community at htotw.com/discord. And until next time, remember, not all those who wander are lost. Our website with show notes and all the links to everything, including all the stuff I just mentioned, you can find that at htotw.com or at humaniststakeontheworld.com. Either one will get there. Can you give me 5 more minutes, Kylie? Don't push the button.